Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name as always is Alex Moellering and I'm excited to be your instructor tonight. And we're actually going to be working on something kind of different. So I've been a little hesitant to begin endgames with this class, mostly because it's the area of the game that I'm the least familiar with. It requires a lot of precise calculation and a lot of study and knowledge. But at the same time, it's also an important part for most chess games, so we got to tackle it at some point. So tonight, we're going to be looking at the beginning of the endgame. What are endgames? How do we survive them? And how can we push forward and win? So the first thing I want to kind of talk about is this idea with endgames of known positions. One of the struggles a lot of people have with endgames, myself included, is one wrong move could completely lose you the game. If you're playing an opening or a middle game and you make kind of a weird move or something a little off, usually it won't be that impactful until you get to higher and higher levels. But one wrong move in the end game could be the difference between winning and losing. So with a known position, we're going to try and eliminate some of the amount of calculation we have to do. And by that I can say, if I'm looking at this position, it doesn't matter white or black to move, I already know that white is winning this game. With best play. And because of that, if I can go into a puzzle or I'm playing in a game and see that I can get into this type of position, then I don't have to calculate, because once I know I can reach this position, I already know how to win. So what we're going to be working on is, what are these positions that we can get to? How do we know we're going to win? And then what's the technique used to actually win these? So in this particular position, it doesn't matter if it's white or black to move, but it is white to win. Let's start and say that it is white's turn to move. So with white to move, does anyone either online or in the audience have any suggestions? How should white try and win this game? What would you play? Any ideas? How should white make progress here?
King to e6.
Yeah, king to e6. I like this move a lot. We're going to take opposition. So opposition is any time that our king is directly one square away from our opponent's king. That's this little blue circle here that I've used to represent that. And you notice that because we're in opposition, our king is also controlling all three squares in front of the king. And we're actually preparing to move in. So whichever way black moves, black is lost. If black moves to d8, we will go to f7. And if black moves to f8, we will go to d7. So for instance, if king to d8, we move to f7, and we've made what I call the red carpet. And if you see here, all of the squares that our pawn has yet to move on the way to promotion are covered. And so there's just nothing black can do to stop us from promoting this pawn. It doesn't matter what moves are played. Because all of these squares are defended, the pawn is just going to promote. And with a king and queen, if you don't know how to win, this is a great thing to study, but we won't be looking at that tonight. But with a king and a queen, you should be able to win this game quite easily. Now let's imagine that in this position, it's actually black to move. So I'm going to kind of shuffle the pieces around a little bit. And we've returned to this position. It's black to move. And black is thinking, okay, well, you just took opposition and forced me out. So now it's my turn. I'm going to take opposition. What can white do to still win this game? I'll show one option that doesn't work here. If we try and avoid this king by going king to e6 now, with the idea that we want to defend this square where the pawn's going to promote, so we want to move to f7, this doesn't work because their king will then take opposition again, and we can shuffle the pieces around for a while, but this isn't going to get us anywhere. Right? Black can keep bodyguarding this square. So we need to do something else. What else can we do here?
Square.
So we could move back. The issue here is one very important thing to remember with all king and pawn endgames is you always want to keep your king in front of the pawn, because now it gets even worse. This is actually now a draw. Black will bring their king forward, take opposition again, and black is cutting off all squares for our king to move forward. So no matter what we do now, this is actually going to be a draw by force, and we'll take a look at that shortly. The best move in this position is actually just to move the pawn. Normally, you don't want to do this too early, right? You want your king in front of the pawn, but in this case, it actually gives us back opposition. Right now, it's black's turn to move, and our king is the one forcing you away. If you run to this side, then the pawn is promoting and it's defended. And if you run in front of the pawn, the more reasonable option, then we can actually just push the pawn yet again. Our king and pawns defend every square except for one. The king has to move out of the way. And now, what do we play here? Not pawn e8, because if we promote right now, it's not defended. The king will just take it. So what do we have to do first?
King to d7.
Yes, so first thing we gotta, again, make the red carpet. We gotta defend the promotion squares. So that's really our key here. When we have the king and the pawn, we want to, whatever we're doing, we want to make sure that we're able to get our king to defend these very critical promotion squares. And to do that, we can either, if it's our move, we can take opposition, force you out of the way, and then control the squares. And if it's black to move here, then it doesn't matter what they do. If they move away, then we just take the squares. And if they stop our king from advancing, we actually have time to push the pawn. And the king has to run away. We can jump in and defend the square, and the pawn will promote by force. But let's back up, because the point of this is to look at known positions. And in this case, this is the position that we know now. We know that if we get our king to the 6th rank, or if you're black, if you get it to the 3rd, right? But if the king is on this rank, and the pawn is one behind it, so in this case like this, if we were black, it would be the king would be somewhere on the 3rd rank, and the pawn would be somewhere on the 4th rank. If we can do that, then it's a guaranteed win. We know that. So if we can calculate to this position, we know we can win. Let's start at the very beginning here. So this time we have black with a pawn at the edge of the board. What would be your recommendation to win this game? What should we try and do here? Black to move. Any ideas? What should black do to try and win this game? Either you can say moves or just general principles.
Get in front of the pawn.
Yes, so like we just mentioned, the king needs to be in front of the pawn in order to essentially guide it, right? We're trying to form this nice red carpet all the way down for our pawn to just help it march on to promotion. And to do that, we need the king in front of the pawn. Here's what happens if we don't. So let's say black plays one of the worst moves in this position, e5. It looks like a very natural move, trying to get our pawn closer and closer, but without our king in front to guide it, this is actually going to allow our opponent to get a draw. And here's how. So the kings are going to, walk towards the pawns. We can't push it again because then we're not going to be able to defend it. So hopefully you would at least know you got to bring your king in so we can defend this pawn. And now all white needs to do is keep our king from advancing to in front of the pawn. So if we're going to go this way, then now it doesn't really matter. You can go here or here. Probably a slightly more precise move would be to go one back so that when we approach, you can take opposition. Right? Again, this idea that we're cutting off the king from approaching from every angle. So the king now you either have to push the pawn or back up. And if we try and back up and try maybe like moving in a triangle to, waste a move, it's not going to help. The king's just going to walk back in front. And even if we take opposition, it doesn't matter. because there's still no way for us to get in front of the pawn. Because when we take opposition, their king is forced to move to the side. Now, obviously, they're going to move towards the pawn, not away from it. But now, the option we have open is to move this way. But if we do that, we're still going to lose our pawn. Right? This is too slow. It looks nice. We're trying to get in front of the pawn, but the king just walks here because it's not guarded anymore, and there's no way to save this pawn. The game is a draw. So this isn't going to work. So again, regardless, as long as they keep our king even with or behind the pawn, white can hold a draw here. So let's see what happens when we get all the way to the end, because we can advance this pawn. Let's say e4. We keep pushing up. The king's going to block us again. We can play e3. The king is blocking us. And we can slowly maneuver our way to the end of the board. But in this position, it's actually really important. King e1 is the most important move at this position. Because if they play king to f1 or d1, now opposition matters. Because white is stuck now at the edge of the board. Taking opposition now actually just transposes to that known position we were looking at before. Whichever way they move, we can push the pawn, and we get the same red carpet effect. So, in order to prevent that, king e1 here now is the most precise move, because whichever way we go, they will stop us once again from moving forwards. So if king to d3, for instance, then king to d1, taking opposition, and we can either back off or push forward the pawn. If we back off and try and reset the situation, white will just stay in front of the pawn and then move back directly backwards, preparing to take opposition again, right? Again, preparing to meet us and stop our king from advancing forward. And this is just going to be a draw. So what happens if we go back a few moves, and ultimately we have to push this pawn forward, right? It's the only thing that we can try. And you can hope and pray that your opponent just gets really confused and moves their king over to c1. That would be a lovely turn of events, but no. King to e1 is the move. And this is a Zugswang, which is a slightly more advanced term. I believe it's German, but it's a tactic or an idea in chess where whatever move we play, we're worse. This is one of the situations in chess where if black could pass, that would be the best move. Because if we could pass and white has to move, then white's going to have to step out of the way of the pawn and we can defend it. Because we have to move, every move we play is bad, right? We can't move with the pawn. And all of these king moves, except for one, just sacrifice the pawn, right? If we just move away, you would just take the pawn. This is a draw. The only move that we can play to defend the pawn ends the game in a stalemate. Our king and our pawn control every possible square black's king could move to. White's king. So white has no legal moves, which means the game is a draw because it's no legal moves but not check. So that's what happens if our king is behind the pawn. And let's just really quickly run through that again. White is going to keep their king stopping us. Whatever they need to do, they're just going to keep blockading our king. We're never going to be able to approach. And when we get to the very edge of the board, they're going to play this really important move, king to e1, preparing to take opposition, right? Whatever way we go, they're going to meet us. And if we don't move up, right, if we don't actually take opposition, then they can just bounce back and stop our pawn from moving forward. We can reset. But yeah, no matter what is played, whichever way we go, the king will stop us. We can shuffle around if we'd like to, but it won't make a difference. Eventually, we will have to push the pawn forward. And the king steps in front. If we defend our pawn, it is stalemate. If we run away, the pawn hangs. Either way, the game is a draw. So, that is another known position we can add to our repertoire. Right? Any position like this where we know that one side can keep the king behind the pawn that's trying to promote, that's going to be a draw. But now let's take a look at how to actually promote the pawn. So in this case, it's going to be slightly different. We're going to move our king in front of the pawn first. If they take opposition or not, here's what's really important. If you can, you want to leave at least one space between your king and your pawn. And the reason is, if you take opposition, then your opponent has to back off. You can keep moving forward. But if your opponent takes opposition, then we need a waiting move. Because if we keep bouncing back and forth, they can follow us forever. And we can never make forward progress in the position. So the waiting move we play here is pawn up. And now we've taken opposition because white has to move. They have to move one way or another, and we can advance and infiltrate the position the other direction. So here, if king to d3, for instance, it allows king to b4. And we are slowly building this red carpet. And I'm using red intentionally just because it's nice, but it's also the nice kind of visual image, you know? This pawn is maybe doesn't look like much now, but if it gets to the edge of the runway, it's going to be beautiful. So we got to support it there. Okay. King to c2. Again, if they let us take opposition, we want to take it. And we keep advancing. If they don't, then we can, push the pawn. But here's the nice thing is once we get our king to the 5th, or the 6th or the 3rd, we already know if we get our pawn here now, it doesn't matter whose move it is, we're going to win. And white can't stop us from getting our pawn here. So black should win this game. So black to move, let's ask, what should black play here to win this game?
E6.
What was it, sorry?
King to
E6. C6, you mean?
Yeah, C6.
Sure, king to c6. Okay, we'll force our opponent's king out of the way. King d1.
Pawn up.
Okay, I'll come back, take opposition.
Move the pawn again.
Okay, so now you're forcing me out of opposition.
King to b2.
Yes. Right, now that the pawn is here on the 6th, or sorry, on the 4th, I am ready to bring the king forward, form the red carpet, and all of the promotion squares are defended. So the king, again, whatever white plays here, we are going to promote to a queen. Or a rook, or whatever you want, but probably a queen or a rook. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about that? Because this is, again, the idea here is we want to establish this as a known position in our repertoire. That you know if you get into a position where you're like, okay, it could be anything. Your king could be way over here. I'm just going to shuffle a few times. But in this position, say it's black to move. Say there's been some trades, we got to the crazy end of a game, and now all I need to do is figure out, can I win with this one extra pawn? I need to see, okay, can I get my king in front of my pawn? If the answer is yes, then black can win. In this case, it looks like I'm going to be able to do that. White is not going to be able to stop me from getting in front of the pawn here. And black is winning. So if you know the technique, then you should be good. Right? King's going to have to step out of the way. If they step to the side, we infiltrate whichever way they go. If they step back, we can just chase them backwards, right? There's no problem here.
I have a question.
Yes.
What would prevent you from advancing the pawn 2 squares and forcing a check?
Where? Like here? Or...
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, the danger is you really want to keep your king in front of the pawn. It might not always force a draw, but anytime our king is even with the pawn, there's a chance if they can get their king in front. So here, let's actually go back here. So yeah, let's say here, we can move our pawn up to call check. Now, white's king is going to step in front, and we cannot get in front of the pawn. If we try and run off to the side and go around, they're just going to approach it. And our pawn is going to fall. So we're going to have to do something else. If we just want to wait and move to the side, they're going to attack our pawn, and we're behind it now trying to defend. If we push the pawn, we're behind it. And we've already seen that either way, if we end up behind the pawn, then we can't win. If they know what they're doing, at least. So you really want to be careful of that. And always make sure if you can, just keep your king in front of the pawn, just as a safety precaution. So like, yeah, here I would say I might just push the pawn up 1, just so I know I still have a little bit of space and there's no threats of them taking opposition here. And wherever they go, I can either take opposition or I can, keep pressing forwards. Question from the chat. In a low time situation, what would you play to try and confuse a lower rated player into a blunder? If you're talking specifically about like these king and pawn endgames, if I'm looking to induce a blunder, then I'm probably the player with white. Because I can't win, I can only draw if they give up this pawn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get my king as close as I can. I'm going to try and keep, putting tension on the position, taking opposition as much as I can, and, just hoping they don't know what to do. And I'm going to just make it as hard as possible for them. And any time that I can, try and trick them into blocking their pawn, anytime I can trick them into, not making the best move, that's probably what you just have to do. But the best way to do it is just know the position really, really well. Understand what makes one side win, what makes one side lose. And in this case, I know that black needs to keep their king in front of the pawn. If I can at any point trick them into playing, one wrong move, like say we're somewhere in this position and my opponent is just, trying to advance the pawn. This is pretty easy to do, right? And now this is a draw. It doesn't look like it, but the king is in front of the pawn, but there's no waiting move. I've taken opposition, and now you're going to have to shuffle to the side forever. Or you're going to have to move backwards, and now I've stopped you. So just, knowing the position well is going to help you do that. Okay, any other questions about promoting with the king and the pawn against a king? Okay, one other thing to note in promotion is there's a big difference if the pawn is a rook pawn. So by rook pawn, we mean one of the pawns that starts on the file where the rooks start, so these two edges of the board. If it's a rook pawn, then with best play, it's a draw either way. Now, if you're playing with white, you want to try and, again, maybe confuse your opponent into not knowing what to do and trying to promote. But if you're black, there's a really simple thing you can do here that's going to help you win the game. So if anyone had the black pieces here, what would you play just to, really make a very easy draw and not let your opponent have a win? There's a very, foolproof way to guarantee yourself at least a draw in this position.
Well, I know where you're supposed to end up, but I don't know.
Where are you supposed to end up?
In the corner.
Yeah, so the amazing thing here is you don't have to worry about the king being in front of the pawn. You don't have to worry about slowing the pawn down, taking opposition. All you have to do is get your king to this corner and bounce. Back and forth. So in this position, I'm just going to move to the corner, and I'm just going to shuffle. For the rest of the game, I'm going to play king to b8, king to a8, king to b8, until my opponent doesn't let me play one of those moves. Because your king will never be able to approach and take this square. You'll never be able to defend the promotion square. And at some point, you can play as many waiting moves as you want to, but eventually, it doesn't really make a difference. I can even not take the pawn. I don't have to. Because at some point, you are going to have to push this pawn. Check, and I'm going to run to the corner. And it's the same thing as before. You either defend the pawn, and it's a stalemate. Or you move the king away, and I take it. You can, Sam Jam, bounce back and forth on a different rank. The difference is you can be forced away from that rank. So, I could try and bounce back and forth here, but eventually white can, force me off of this rank, because now I have to step backwards. So it doesn't really make a difference, because the result's going to be the same anyway, but just without having to worry or think about it, if you just go to the corner, you're at the edge of the board, there's nothing they can do to force you out. So if they push the pawn, it's just going to be a draw. And if they don't, then they're not promoting, and it's going to be a draw either way. So just a little amendum I wanted to add to that. Okay. again, something to help us, in endgames, like I talked about, calculations are really, really important because one move can make the difference between winning and losing. So in this case, is it white to move? It is white to move. I want you to tell me, do you think that white can promote or that black can catch the pawn before promotion? So is this game a win for white or will this game be a draw? What do you think? And yes, MMA Matrix, only the flank pawn, that works. Anything else, you want to stop their king from being in front of the pawn. Or you want to keep your king in front of the pawn as much as it can. But with flank pawns, it doesn't matter. Okay, white to move in this position. Can the pawn promote, or will the black king stop it? What do we think?
Stop.
King will stop it, okay.
I don't think so.
You think
I don't
king
think the king can stop it.
king can't stop it, okay. If white move, you can promote. Looks like white's on time, white wins, so we have some different thoughts. Here's the way to do it, right? You can calculate and you can think, okay, pawn moves, king moves, pawn moves, king moves, pawn moves, king moves. But it's very easy when you're playing over the board, you don't have this nice arrow function, to lose track of squares or forget which pieces where, and it just takes some more time. You have to really think it through. A very easy tip is called the box method. And for those who don't know it, it's a super, super clear-cut way to figure out which side will win in this type of situation. So what you do is you figure out when it's the king's turn to move. So right now it's white's turn to move. Where is our pawn going to be when it's black's turn to move? And the answer to that is on h4. The pawn will move 2 spaces. Right? So this is one trick. You want to be careful if the pawn is starting on the 2nd or 7th rank because it can move those 2 spaces, and that can make all the difference. So the pawn will be on h4. So now we create an imaginary box, right, where we start on this square, and we create the box in a diagonal to the edge of the board. Now this is just a line, but to make it a box, you then, just connect all the points. So this is our box, right? The pawn will be on h4 when it is our opponent's turn to move. We make a diagonal from where the pawn will be to the edge of the board. And this is our box. And the way we solve this is if black's king can step into the box on their turn, so that includes all of these squares. If they can step into any square in the box, then black will catch the pawn. If not, they will miss it. And in this case, we can also see by how many moves, right? Black is 1 square away from the box, so they're going to be 1 square away from stopping the pawn. Black is 1 square too slow, the pawn promotes. And this works every time. It is a really, really useful tool instead of having to, sit and count all of those moves out. So here's another example. All right, so it's black's turn to move. Can white catch the pawn or not? And the pawn is moving this way. What do we think? Will the white can catch the pawn?
Yep.
Let's take a look. Pawn will come to g5. So this is our box. And it looks like white indeed can enter the box. Because it can only just enter the box and it's not already in there, it's going to catch it on the very last move. Pawn up. King moves, pawn up, king moves, pawn up, king moves, pawn up, and we catch it just in time. So this is useful for a lot of reasons. Again, it can help you just calculate some really complicated positions. Here's a way we can start to maybe apply this. So in this example, it is white's turn to move. And as we can see, we have 2 pawns to black's 1 pawn. But black's king is closer. So if we had our king closer, we could brute force our way through, trade pawns, and promote, and you couldn't stop us. Black's king is closer, which means the question is, can we force one of our pawns to promote before black can catch us? What do we think? Can black draw this game, or can white force a win here? And remember, you can use the tool of the box if you know what square the pawn's going to be on when it's black's turn to move. But we do have to think of every option black has. And let me give you one example that doesn't work. If we try and move our king in, this isn't going to work, right? Black's king beats us in the race. And anything we try to do now, it's too late. The king will stop us. So, white to move. What do we do? So we have some people say white wins, some people say draw, some people say play h5 and then play g5. What do we think? Give you another minute or so to take a look at this one. Can white force a win or can black force a draw?
Black can force a draw.
Okay, so we have black can force a draw. Does anyone in here think white can force a win? Okay, so either everyone's unsure or black can force a draw. Well, let's take a look and see what actually can happen. So, someone in the chat actually... Oh, sorry? Someone say something?
So I feel like white can win.
White can win? Okay. How do you think white's going to win? What should they try and do? Right, moving the king doesn't work, so which of these pawns do you move? Or does it matter?
You would move the outer, or the inside pawn, the one closest to the king.
Okay, we're going to move our g pawn.
Yeah.
Real quick, someone in the chat suggested moving this pawn first. I actually think this move doesn't really make a lot of intuitive sense. I think they're thinking, when we push this one, this is one space closer. But the problem is still their king is, I think, too close. Because now we can start to think about the box. I'm going to move my king in. If I push this pawn up, black does not have to take. If I take, I think you're right. If I take, now my pawn runs. And my pawn is going to be outside of the box of this king. But if I don't take, and this pawn slips past, my king's going to catch it. But now I got one more thing I got to think about. What if I take this pawn with this pawn? Okay, my king's going to be outside of the box again. So it looks like, maybe black is going to, be able to, maybe white can win here. But there's a really interesting thing to consider. This pawn is also running. White gets a queen, and this pawn is here, but it looks like the queen can stop her motion. So does h5 work? That's a really good question. Oops. h5. King over. g5. King e5. Pawn takes. King f6. King is in the box. So with precise play, we can realize the king is going to be in this box. So h5 is not quite good enough. Let's take a look at g5. So g5 seems to be the move that makes the most sense. We're threatening quite a few things here. What are black's options here? What should black play, right? What do you think is the best move for black? Especially those who think black can hold a draw here. What should black do?
Black should take the pawn.
Yeah, take the pawn seems like the only reasonable option. Anything else is not going to work. And we can, again, use the box to figure that out. If h5, just trying to blockade, this pawn is going to be, the king is outside of the box. So this pawn will promote, and this one will be stuck with this one, so white wins.
Mm-hmm.
And if the king tries to move in, what about then?
He won't catch up.
It's not going to catch up. Let's take a look. Pawn goes up. Wait a minute. Isn't the king inside the box? What do you think?
Spaces regardless. Like, and 3.
Oops.
Yeah.
So, yeah, wait. So if black just moves to the king, is this a draw?
Yeah.
No, because the pawn can take.
Pawn can take. The pawn doesn't have to move forward. That would mean then this is the box. But the pawn can also take, which means this is the box, and the king cannot get into that. So king moving is also too slow. So black has to take. Only reasonable move. What should white play here?
Take or keep going for us.
So we have two options to consider. How do we calculate this out? If we have to think about both boxes, right? If we take this pawn, the box is here, the king enters the box. If we take, this is a draw. Black's king is just barely close enough to catch us. So what if we don't take? What if we push? What happens here?
You win.
We push, the king is outside of the box, but now, again, we have to think, black also has a pawn, and our king is also outside of that box. So now, it's a race of the pawns. Pawn, pawn, up, up, promote, promote. Both sides have a queen at the same turn. This game is a draw. White cannot force a win in this position, remarkably, despite having these two pawns, because the king is just barely too close. The king is able to fight off the box. The only way we can try and, circumvent that problem is by pushing past, and then black's king is truly outside of the box, but so is our king. Both sides will get a queen. Oops.
So
Yes.
it's possible to win it if they both promote and one of them blunders, though, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. If somebody blunders, then yes, 100%. Either player could win this game. But with best play, it's a draw. There's no way for one player to force the other player into checkmate. If it was black's turn to move, it'd be interesting because white's king is very near the edge of the board. There might be a way to try and force some kind of checkmate. I don't think there would be, but regardless, with it's white's turn to move, black's king is too much in the center, and anywhere you try and go to check and force the king away, eventually the queen will be able to intercept. So with best play, this will be a draw, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still play on from this position, right? Especially against some lower rated opponents. Okay. Let's move to another example here. This time I want to look at something slightly easier. If you have two connected passed pawns, there's a really simple trick to know that's going to help you win without really thinking about it. If you do all the same things you did with the king and one pawn, you're going to be fine. If you get your king in front of the pawn, and keep your king in front of the pawn and slowly, make the red carpet and guide your two pawns down, you can absolutely win that way. It will take a little more time, a little more calculation, a little more thinking, especially to make sure you're not creating any stalemate threats or anything like that. So, the very easy technique I would recommend here is very simple. You can start by just pushing the pawns. And you can let white get as close as he wants. And now, white has a problem. Because you can now bring your king in and start working to keep moving these pawns forward. And even though this pawn is not defended, white cannot take it. Because again, let's think about the box. If white takes this pawn, this is our box, and white's king on d5 will be too far away to get into this box. The pawn will run, and white cannot catch him. So because of that, you just very simply keep moving your king forward and keep pushing these pawns. As long as one of them is defended, and you can either get your king in front or not, it doesn't really make a difference. But we're just going to slowly shuffle our king and move him forward until we can push another pawn forward. And then you can make this position again. We can just shuffle our king. Even if we aren't defending this pawn, it doesn't matter, The only reason we're moving our king to the side and not backwards is because we do want to keep defending these squares. And eventually we're just going to get to this kind of endgame. So now you have to be careful not to stalemate here. What should black play to win this game and not blunder a draw here? Black to move, how can we win? We've gotten both pawns here to the third rank. Tessibs, I don't know how to say your name in the chat, but it says king c2. I think you mean king c3 probably, but bring the king closer. Okay, this makes sense to me. And now white wants to stop you from defending a promotion square, so let's say king here to d1. Now our king can't come closer. What should we do here?
Pawn to d2.
Pawn to d2, okay. King only has one move, king e2.
King to c2.
Yeah, king c2 now, and we are defending a pawn. It doesn't matter that they can take this one, once again, because we are promoting. So the important thing, though, is to not fall into kind of a stalemate idea. So back in this line, you could also just push the pawn forward. You can bring the king in. I would push a pawn first and do the same thing. And just here's where we have to be a little careful, right? We're going to do the same thing as before. If you end up in this type of position, the key is just do not play something like king to d3, which will, happily stalemate your opponent for them, not so happily for you. But no, you just keep moving around and forcing the king out. And eventually, whether we do it, this way or this way, the king has to move. We can defend the promotion square and happily get a queen. So someone wants to play just pawn to e2 for spice. I guess you can. I think you're looking at like this position. Play here maybe. And I don't know exactly what you're saying, but yeah, you can be spice if you want, but as long as you defend the promotion square, that's the most important thing. All right, here's another one. This one's a little more complicated. So white to move in this position, what would you play here? We have two connected pawns versus one pawn from black, and there we do need to be a little bit precise.
Check.
Sorry?
I said check.
Check. So d5 check. Okay, so that's one recommendation. King e4 recommended in the chat. Any other moves, or anyone agree with one of those two moves?
Oh, it's white to move?
It's white to move, yeah. How can we try and win this game? I'll tell you, white can win this game. So the way to do it, d5 has been suggested, king to e4 suggested. Sorry?
Yeah, it doesn't matter because either pawn could defend technically.
So here's what's interesting is I will tell you it actually does matter a great deal, and both of these moves draw the game. With best play, black can win, and we can figure that out by thinking of our known positions. What's going to happen in either case is our king is going to be stuck behind the pawn. Because black has this extra pawn, black has a really beautiful way to win. If let's say king to e4, for instance. If king to e4, d5, check, and they're either taking this pawn and running, or we take them, king to d6. We cannot continue to defend this pawn, so we have to move our king away. Doesn't matter where you go. Black takes, and now look what happened. We have a king and one pawn, and our king is behind the pawn. Black forces a draw. If d5 first, check. I actually don't remember this line exactly, but d5, the king can just move backwards. And the problem is they're going to keep us away. They're going to keep our king behind the pawns. And at whatever point we try and break through a c5, they will trade, and our king will be behind our pawn. So something like this, for instance, the king can just kind of move back, but whatever point we try to trade, They'll be ready to take opposition. And again, this is a known position. We know this is a draw. With best play, our king is stuck behind the pawn, and we have not reached the 6th rank yet. Black is surviving. But it's funny because king e4 looks, to me, this is probably what I would play if I didn't know this position. It looks like such a natural move. So you have to be really, really careful to, calculate what can my opponent do. King to e4. Pawn amazingly pushed to d5 check. This is forcing a trade. And then the king can sit here on d6, and my king will be stuck behind my pawn. If we know that a king behind a pawn will force a draw, then you have to be careful of this. So what's a way we can win this, avoiding that kind of trap?
Check.
Well, we looked at check. Check doesn't work, remember, because after d5, the king's going to back off, and our king is going to be behind the pawn. They're going to force our...
So you gotta find a way to get the king.
So we need to get our king in front of the pawns. If we don't do that, we won't be able to win.
So leave him out.
Threaten the pawn?
Sorry?
Do you threaten the pawn?
How?
Like, what is the...
Like here?
Yeah, C, yeah.
So c5 doesn't work, because if we play c5, they'll take our pawn. We take theirs, and king takes.
You can't defend the pawn the whole time.
So yeah, well, let me ask you. So if we play here, they take, what are you going to do?
Yeah, you're right.
If you don't take, then whatever you do, they're going to take you next move. If I go here, they're just going to take me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we can't trade our pawns here. So the way to win this is, yeah, someone is suggesting king to c3, which I believe you can win, but it'll maybe be a little harder. I would go king to e3, and my idea is I need to avoid this. This is what we're going to call a landmine square. If I step on this square, then I've blown up, right? Because they're going to push forward, and we know that's going to be a draw. So king to e3. I think king c3 probably works. It'll just take a little longer. But king e3, and my idea is I'm going to walk around this dangerous square and try and force my king in front of the pawn this way. So let's say black to move. Now, at any point, they can't ever play d5 unless I'm on this square. If black tries to play d5 now, what will I do? White to move.
C5.
c5. Importantly, not taking the pawn. If we trade, then again, their king is going to end up in front, and our king cannot support the pawn. So we push past to c5, and we're going to be able to slowly bring our king in and help the pawn promote, because this pawn is going to be too weak and it's going to fall. So they can't ever push d5. So instead, the king's going to have to run around and try and stop us. We're going to keep moving forward, still avoiding that landmine square of e4. Because again, even here, it's going to be the same thing. Right? We always have to be very careful of that. So we're going to keep moving around, and black is going to try and stop us at every turn. So black is now stopping our king from moving forward. We have to keep routing around here to the side. Whenever we can, we're going to take opposition, because that's going to force our opponent to make a choice. You either run away from the pawn and we take it, or you move back to defend it, and I keep encroaching, right? My king keeps moving forward. If you take opposition, again, my pawns are stopping black's king from advancing, so I can keep running around to the side. I believe this will also work here, but I think the computer gives this nice move d5, with the idea that my king is going to get in front of your pawn first. You can't run over here, right? You have to stay and keep stopping my king, because if you run forward, you get one of my pawns if you want, but I'm going to get this one eventually, and my king is in front. So your king can't do that. Instead, you have to back off. And white's just going to keep, slowly taking opposition, keep pushing you away. Wherever black goes, we can still take opposition. Eventually, this pawn is falling. It's very slowly, methodically moving in. And every time you take opposition, you're forcing the opponent to concede space. And here again, we have a king and 2 pawns, a very, very easy win for white. So again, coming back to this, the importance of this lesson is really the landmine square. You want to be really careful and think about what moves your opponent can play that are going to mess you up. And the nice thing is we don't have to calculate to the end of a game, right? With our idea of known positions, if I can calculate, okay, my king is going to step onto e4, wanting to defend my pawns. If my opponent calls check, it seems bad because I will take it, but then their king steps in front, and now my king can't defend this pawn anymore, right? It's on this square, my pawn is blocking me here, and their king is covering this square. So I have to back off, I'm going to lose a pawn, and my king's going to be behind the pawn. So being able to calculate just that far in advance, right, it's still a decent amount of calculation, right? Endgames are tough, but being able to calculate to this position is much, much easier than trying to calculate the whole rest of the game. Because once you reach here, you can stop calculating. You say, okay, I know that's a draw. I can't win that game. Let's just try and find a different variation. Okay. A couple more examples here. In this case, white is up a passed pawn, right? We have these 2 pawns to the side, both connected for white and black, but white has this 1 extra pawn over here on b4. And black's king is going to, try and keep us from advancing. Notice that our king is behind the pawn, equal with it, so it's not ahead. So the question is, can white win this position, or with best play, can black force a draw? What do we think? Easy win for white, someone says in the chat. White win. No one can make pawn moves, seems like a draw. So we have some back and forth thoughts. Let's take a look at this position. And actually, Moellering has the right idea here. So because these pawns are all locked up and our king is behind the pawns, some people might think, well, this is going to be a draw because I can't do anything with these pawns over here, and black's king is going to keep me behind my pawn forever. The game is a draw. However, when there's more pawns on the board than just this one, we can actually change our plan slightly, because now our plan doesn't have to be how do I promote this pawn. Our plan can be how do I get my king over to these pawns? And the way to do that is to force your king back with this one, and then sacrifice it and run over and pick up these other ones. So a very simple way to do that is we can just, push this pawn forward. We're going to keep taking space. Black is going to do their best to stop our king from moving forward, but we can push our pawn, because the point isn't that we're trying to, keep the pawn safe and defended and promoted. We know we can't do that. Black can keep stopping us, but eventually we can abandon it. I might even go one move farther, but it doesn't really make a difference, because at some point we can say our king is going to be closer and I'm going to be able to pick up these pawns, and you have to stop me from both taking these pawns to promotion and this one, and you can't pick both. If you try and go the other way and stop me over here, you can't stop this pawn from promoting. So black has to fall back and stop this pawn here. And by the time they've taken it, it is too late. We have gobbled up these other 2 pawns.
So if you push a check on b7 there, then you'll force a draw. Is that correct?
Where?
Right there.
No. If you push on b7, you don't force a draw if you're willing to abandon this pawn. The lesson is the same, right? You need to run away and see that I can take these pawns first. If I try and defend it, then yeah, this is a draw. This is a stalemate because no pawns can move, and black's king is fully trapped in this corner. But if you're willing to let go of this pawn and say the point is this pawn I'm using is kind of a sacrificial lamb, and I'm going to be able to get to these faster than black's king. My king will be in front, and I have two beautiful pawns. Then white is going to be winning. And I want to show a very similar theme with this next one. So in this game, both sides have two pawns. White has two connected pawns. Black has two separated pawns, but one of them is a passed pawn with nothing in front of it. And black's king is behind the pawn. First impressions of this position, what do we think? Is one side winning? Is one side drawing? I believe it's black to move here. No, I'm sorry, it's white to move here. What do we think of this position? If you're not sure, that's fine, but feel free to take a guess. Seems like a draw. It is white to move. Seems like a draw. Force the black G pawn to make a choice. Different thoughts here. I'll tell you, Stockfish says this is a draw, and I believe Stockfish. But this was actually a Grandmaster game. I want to see if I wrote down who played it. I did not. I'll look that up and maybe put it in the comments later. But it was a master level game, maybe not a Grandmaster. But in this game, it was white to move, and white actually played a losing move. White played the move G4, which actually loses in this position. Black now goes from having a draw to being able to force a win. So does anyone take a shot and trying to figure out what black did here to win this game? Again, endgames are tough. One wrong move can be the difference between winning and losing. What would you play if you had the black pieces?
Move your pawn.
This one?
Yep.
Yeah, this is it. And this is actually very similar to the last position that we just looked at. The difference is black doesn't have this extra pawn here, right? In the last position, it was 2 and 2 and one extra pawn. But in this position, black doesn't need this extra pawn. And here's why, is because we can look and see if white ever tries to push this pawn, what's going to happen?
It's gonna die.
We take, and now we have a race again. So we have to calculate that out. Push, 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 push. We get a queen, and they don't. Oh, I'm sorry. They do get a queen, but the difference is it's the box again. I'm sorry.
You get it more. You get it check.
Is here, black's king is in this box. White's king is not in this box. So we can abandon our pawn on b5, run over and stop this one. And white cannot get to this pawn in time. Doesn't matter if you take it or not. White is too far outside of the box. So black is winning if you ever try and push. So instead, in the game, king to b3 was played. King to d5. And again, black realizes, I don't need this pawn. It's the same thing as last time. This is the sacrificial lamb. My pawn is going to get here first. Now in this position, it's black to move. You have to be very careful. What move should black play here in order to still win this game? Because you can go very, very wrong here. That's what white would play it for. It's black to move. Okay, king f4 suggested. Oh, you're good. Any other thoughts? What would you play? Black to move.
E5.
King e5.
Yes.
Okay. Someone said something else?
I said
F4, okay. Yeah, I think E5 probably is okay. But there's, I think both of these moves do the same thing. F4 is the best move. And the reason is, if we go to F3, which looks like the very natural response, what is white going to play?
Pawn to H4.
Yeah, we always need to keep an eye on the box. So in this position, white can push their pawn now. And our pawn's going to be out of the box. Or sorry, yeah. Here, then push, and there's no way to stop it. Because either you take our pawn and this one runs, or you don't take our pawn and it either takes you or runs forward. If, for instance, if pawn takes, then you cannot stop this pawn from running, and they're both going to become queens. And if you take our pawn here on g4, then we take your pawn, and there are no pawns left. So you have to be very careful. You always want to stay in the box. So king to f4 here. Yeah, king takes g4 does not work because I'll just take and there's no pawns left. So king to f4. King f3 is a draw. After h4, there's no good move for black. So king to f4, staying in the box, staying ready to defend. And now this idea doesn't work because my king catches you. So king to c4. What else? King to d3. And white tries to get in front and take opposition, and they are so close, but they are one move too slow. Black's king stays ahead of the pawn, and we have seen this position before. How does black win in this position?
He doesn't have to go anywhere.
How does black win? What do we do?
Just promote your pawn.
Just promote the pawn. Because we're reaching this rank without check, we are cutting off these squares, and the king has to move out of the way. We come defend the promotion square, and the game is over. So that is all the time we have tonight, but thank you all for joining, both in person and online. Hope you learned something about the endgames. Again, it's very tricky, so feel free to keep studying at your own pace, and I hope to see you again next week. Take care, everyone.
Don't